It's September the 15th, 2024, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo,
Hey, how are you?
solid. Doing well. I fought Merkel yesterday.
How did it go?
Heckin' owned him.
Nice.
Yeah, I was pretty stressed going up to it because I wiped on him last time I did honor mode. He's very difficult because he's resistant to a whole bunch of stuff, and he has a bunch of skeletons that he spawns, and he frightens you, which is also a big problem, and then you can't receive healing when you're close to him.
Yeah.
So my strat was get my sword bard and my sorcerer. Very first turn, they dimension doored over to the mind flayer, killed him in a turn,
Yeah.
and then Misty stepped over to Dame Aelin to get her up, and then we fight regular Ketheric and just clean up the little brains. And then once Big Bone Man shows up, just all in him. There are some other necrolytes that are up on the cliff over on the far left, and I didn't even touch them. They just cast like a really weak spell. So the clutch plays from it were actually protection from evil and good. If you cast that on yourself, you are immune to being frightened by undead celestials, fae, and fiends. So he can't frighten you if you have protection from evil and good. Also, heroism makes you immune to frighten as well. So I had Minthara with heroism on herself, and then protection from evil and good on my monk. And then what else? There's like a radiant smite that you can do with the vengeance paladin, which can blind the target, and I blinded him, then stunned him. It was just over from there.
There you go.
Yeah. But it's a very
Well
fun
done.
fight. Yeah, I was stressed going up to it, and I made a video talking about going through like all the different elixirs. So multiple characters had the strength elixir, and then I had the battle mage's power elixir on Karlach, the sorcerer, and then I think I had necrotic resist on Minthara, just to be able to soak damage up in the front. Yeah, it was a really cool
Okay.
fight. I'm excited for us to do it when we get there.
Yeah, usually I just pop and viz on everybody and then move in so that I can get Dame Aelin the first turn.
Mm-hmm. That's probably smarter than what I did.
No? I mean, what you did worked, right? So that's totally viable.
Yeah, there was someone who in chat was saying give Scratch an invis potion and have him do it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would probably work. You wouldn't have to pop a whole bunch of invis potions to do it either. So
Yeah.
oh,
I like
that's
the RP and fantasy of stealthing the whole team, though. Getting the dog to go on a specific mission to save the angel is a little bit more far-fetched, but play the game as you will.
Well, he's a good dog.
That's true.
I did get the patch downloaded, so
Nice.
that should be ready this time.
Awesome. The dog can free person. The dog can use the ability help, which help can get someone out of a snare, or it can help them if they're downed, or it can put a fire out if they're on fire. So Scratch can help, so he can also get Dame Aelin out of the thing, because it's the same action.
I did beat Dark Descent, finally.
Ooh.
That's a fun one. Probably took much longer than it should have. I've read that it's supposed to be more like 13 to 20 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I probably spent 3 times that. There were long stretches where I was just kind of hiding, waiting for a good moment to try to stealth my way through the map, so that adds a lot of time.
Yeah, that's fine though. I feel like going on a game to speedrun it specifically means you're gonna miss out on a lot of cool stuff. Like, I'm glad that you showed me the Thaniel quest chain and how to try to save the land and stuff, because I had never done that before. And you don't have to do that. There's a lot of stuff in games that you don't have to do, but if you do it, you get to enjoy the video game more.
Yeah, it's a little more immersive. Dark Descent is certainly very immersive. Story is not necessarily super great. It's kind of more like one of the Aliens comics from back in the 90s. I don't know how familiar you are with those, but they took a very different tack than the movies did. You know, still a horror element, but they kind of added on their own sci-fi elements. Yeah, they basically ignored the whole Prometheus lineage that was added to the lore and just did more of a 90s comic thing, which was cool. It just was not like high cinema, you know. But as far as atmosphere, very, very good. It
That's a
certainly
more
makes
gritty
you very
thriller.
tense.
That's what it sounds
Yeah,
like.
yeah, exactly. So I'm trying to talk myself out of replaying that. Really don't need to, even though I kind of want to.
It would be faster a second time through.
Yeah, yeah, that's one of the arguments in favor. Kind of know where everything is now, so it wouldn't be quite so much sneaking around in constant paranoia about what's going to be around the next corner. Now I kind of know.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at for BG3, because I've beat it once and then now it's like, okay, what are the different ways you can beat it, and then also who are the other characters that I didn't get any lore on because we did a 4-person run.
Gotcha.
Been playing a bunch of Dota as well. StarCraft is in a really good place too, and I've been having fun playing with the new keyboard.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. There was a... Go ahead.
Sounds like... I was just going to say, it sounds like things are going well there.
Yep. Aside from the cat having allergic reaction and being kind of puffy.
Oh,
We are doing
poor
okay.
guy.
Yeah. We tried a new medicine on him that's supposed to help with some other issues, and it did solve those other issues, but it also made him really puffy, so we think that he was slightly allergic to it, maybe.
Gotcha. Well, here's hoping for a speedy recovery.
Same. So there was one really obvious news item from today. You can probably guess what it was.
Oh, the Trump thing at the
Yeah.
golf course?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was reading about that a couple hours ago. Yeah, last I checked, one of the, I don't know if it was security or Secret Service, but one of the guards on the golf course noticed the barrel of a gun sticking through some bushes at the fence around the golf course. So he fired upon the gunman, and then the gunman fled. And he actually got in his car and got away, but somebody in the area took some photos of the license plate and of the car. So they were able to catch him later. So he's currently under arrest. As far as I know, the gunman never actually fired at anybody. So nothing much actually happened. But there's now, of course, talk that there's another potential assassination attempt. Yeah, I think Donald Trump himself was on the golf course, but I think what I read was that he was still a hole away from the area where the gunman was sitting.
And they caught the
So-
person?
Yeah, they caught him. At least that's what the police were saying at the press conference. So we'll find out more details later. Again, it just happened, so there's not many details. We'll see.
Gotcha.
I guess since we're talking about shootings, I did have a correction for last week. So somebody asked about the shooting, right? And so we talked about it, and I actually got the wrong shooting. It was so they were asking about a shooting, and I thought they were asking. No, they were asking about the Georgia school shooting that had happened that day, or just recently. And I thought they were talking about the shooting in Kentucky, where a guy was firing on cars driving along a freeway. So that's what I had in mind when I was answering the question. That's actually why I brought up the Washington, D.C. sniper, because the cases are similar. So if anybody was confused about why I was talking about the D.C. sniper with regard to a school shooting in Georgia, that's why I didn't think we were talking about that.
Good correction. There was also the presidential infomercial. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I meant to listen to it, and then I totally lost track of time and Dark Descent.
That's
So
fair.
I ended up missing it.
You probably had more fun doing what you
Yeah.
did, but it was pretty funny. As far as like
Well,
different shit that can happen, yeah. Um, Chat, feel free to weigh in, and also in the YouTube comments, let me know like who you thought won the crowd better. But it seemed like, because I knew nothing about Harris, I feel like she performed very well. She got Trump to be off topic multiple times and was like laughing at him for his reactions, and kind of everyone knew that he was overreacting to stuff. So yeah, seeing him go back to like immigrants in prison stealing people's pets to kill them and eat them is like, it's weird that this is his sticking point, but technically valid.
yeah. Well, when it comes to talking points, they don't have to be accurate. They just have to be memorable.
Yeah,
And certainly that's pretty memorable.
that's true.
Yeah, I read about it after the fact, and my main question was whether or not Harris would explicitly fuck things up.
Mm-hmm.
And she did not, so no change. That was about the only outcome there could be. If Harris grievously fucked things up, then that could hurt her in the polls. There really wasn't anything Trump could do to fuck things up to hurt him in the polls, so I wasn't really, I wasn't expecting that one way or the other. So my attention was purely on Harris's performance, and by all accounts, she did okay. It was certainly better than Biden in the last debate. So that's
She had a low bar to go over, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So she cleared that. I don't think she's going to change any minds. From what I read, it didn't sound like she, came out with any like big new revelations or any kind of charismatic performance, that might change minds. But I think really this was just a litmus test to see if she could make it through a debate more than if she could like dramatically change the outcome of the election.
Yeah.
So she passed the cosmic shit test, and now we can move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm. The one thing that stood out to me, and anyone who is like identifying as a leftist per se, Harris isn't really a leftist, so you're not really getting any of those issues championed. And she didn't take a stand for anything really. She tried to take a very centrist approach. To me, as the viewer, it seemed like her mission was to show herself as the more reasonably spoken person at the table, who could do more of the normal presidential shit and not get off track. So it seemed like rather than debate him on a policy or contrast the differences in what their goals are, her strat was to bait him into being silly. And she was able to do that multiple times, where he would go back into like they're changing the gender of immigrants in prisons, like random off the cuff shit. And then she'll say stuff like the rent costs are really high, we want to try to build more housing, and just talk about like basic normal shit of jobs, America, freedom. So if she's able to jobs, America, freedom, and he gets stuck on really weird almost QAnon kind of shit, then for a standard apathetic person, Harris to me seems like the more reasonable option. Trump already had one round in there, so you kind of also have that to assess in terms of what the presidential cycle will be like if he got it again. And I know some people are like, oh my gosh, if he gets the presidency again, it's going to be all over for the US. To me, as a bystander, it seemed like a lot of his big talk didn't actually happen. Like most of his big spooky ideas, like we're going to make this enormous wall along the border of Mexico, that's a project that could be invested in, technically speaking. Like we could have thrown billions upon billions of dollars and made this very elaborate thing, but the American political system, like you said, it has some idiot proofing where if you do get a few silly people in the system, they can flop around for a bit, but they can't really break everything because it's meant to have different checks and balances and things that prevent one bad actor or even a few bad actors doing stuff that's really harmful to the country. So America is still America, post-Trump, and if he wins again, then it'll be fine. Like, the American people are an entity that, if you watch V for Vendetta, you should know your worth as the population of the country. Like, the country is built upon the hard work of regular people who pay their taxes. If you don't have hardworking regular people who are motivated to work and pay their taxes, you don't have a banging economy. So the American people, I feel like, should be emboldened just for who they are and the amount of zug that they provide to the team. So for you to pull weight and for you to have the ability to vote, like, you should throw your weight around, like, decide what you want to invest in by, as a consumer, being informed. Register to vote and vote every time if you really want to make the biggest impact you can. Yes, it's not a perfect system, but compared to almost every other country, or at least a lot of countries, we do have relatively good elections. So if you're going to throw votes in a country, it's better than doing it in some other country where they have a guaranteed winner.
Yeah, you have an immense amount of discretion as an American voter.
Yeah.
It's not as much as people would like, perhaps. But people, for one, have somewhat high expectations for their ability to determine the direction of travel for national politics, which in a country of 300 plus million people, in a country the size of a continent, no less, that's a heavy lift, right? Mm-hmm. That's not a bar you're likely to clear in the best of circumstances. Local and state elections are really where your vote goes further, and you have a lot more ability to influence political outcomes at those levels. But of course, nobody complains about that so much because, of course, politics at the local and generally state level generally actually do reflect the preferences of most voters in those places, to the point where people just kind of take for granted that their government at that level isn't going to grievously piss them off too much. So that's a credit to the health of the overall system, that people are only really mad about national level politics. Generally. Not always, but generally. So yeah. You can definitely influence things. You should participate. And if Trump wins, yeah, that'll probably be a problem institutionally, but Trump is not going to break the system. Like, everything I've seen from him suggests that he wants to co-opt the system for his own purposes. And that's not even new. You know, that used to be the norm for American politics, for much of American history up until maybe, let's say, 70 years ago. You know, it was just expected that politicians would benefit from what was called the spoils system. And they had extensive patronage networks all throughout American politics in that period that specifically lived off of the spoils system. So what I perceive out of Trump is kind of a desire to move back to that, or at least towards that. And that's not great. That's not going to be healthy for the administrative state. It's not going to be great for conflict of interest, and for the overall political culture, it's just taking us backwards. You know, it took a lot of time to kind of break the back of patronage networks in the United States, or at least most of them, and to transition to a political culture and system that was dominated by the middle class and by middle class political preferences. So losing that is unfortunate, or at least it would be unfortunate and would be difficult to fix. That would be a long-term project, but it's been done before, and there's no inherent reason it couldn't be done again, I would argue. So, as you say, I agree with you. It would not be the end of the world if Trump won again.
For someone who has voted Democrat in the past, one of the things that does feel somewhat unfortunate and or fixed is the notion that the Democratic Party serves you the next in line person who has kind of climbed their political system correctly. And it's felt that way. Obama, Hillary Clinton, Biden, and Harris are all perfectly in line for what the party has favored. So in that sense, it doesn't really feel like we have real choice. It's like you can choose the candidate they field, but you can't really punish them by voting for a similar party. You can punish them by voting for the opposite party, but yeah, you can't really like, okay, well, I didn't want Clinton, so I'm getting Sanders here. It's like, no, you're getting Clinton. That's how it is.
Yeah, the primary system is supposed to address that issue, but of course, it has its own issues.
Mm-hmm.
And when the apparatus wants to put its weight behind somebody, that does give them a big advantage. But we've talked before about how the Democrats are increasingly the conservative party, and they're sort of building this grand coalition that is very much anti-populist in nature. And anti-populism is not like a great foundation for a grand political coalition, given that there's so many other issues on which the members of that coalition diverge. But none of those constituent factions within the coalition are strong enough to win on their own either. And a lot of them are very much just at odds with the populists as they are with the Grand Coalition and its other constituents. So, yes, there should be more choice. I think people would like that better. But as I've argued before, if you did have more of a multi party type system here in the US, I don't think you would end up with coalitions that look very much different than the ones we already have. We only have two political parties really that matter in the United States, but those parties have very multitudinous and disparate factions that comprise them. And winning their votes and maintaining their votes comprises a big chunk of modern American politics. And that process is pretty much the same as the process that happens where you have different parties, say in Europe, representing each of those different constituent groups, but then after an election having to negotiate a grand coalition in order to win a majority of seats that would allow them to form a government. And just given the political preferences and ideologies of those different constituent groups, like, it would be pretty much the same. If you look at Germany, for example, right now, they have a resurgent anti-establishment party called AfD that's been doing better, but every time, they win more seats or votes, that just retrenches the anti-populist coalition. It's kind of a norm in German politics that no mainstream political party should form a coalition with the AfD or a political party or movement like the AfD. And so the result has been weird coalitions of center-right and center-left. Currently, there's a center-left government, but it only got a majority because it formed a coalition with liberal Democrats, who are basically the libertarians in Germany, and also the Greens. So that's a very wonky coalition, like in the best of times. And, again, the only reason that exists is because everybody doesn't want to work with the AfD. More recently, there was also skepticism about the CDU, but I suspect in future, if the AfD does continue to do better, which it won't necessarily, but if it did, you would probably see another grand coalition between center-left and center-right. In Germany's case, the SPD and the CDU. So that's the kind of coalition that exists now with the Democratic Party in the United States. It's similar to the CDU-SPD coalition that existed in Germany before and may exist again. And if you look at the history of that coalition in Germany, nobody really liked it. Like, everybody was upset at it for different reasons, right? People on the right thought it was too far to the left in its public policy, and then people on the left thought it was too far. Wait, other way around. People on the right thought it was too far to the left on public policy, and then people on the left thought the coalition was too far to the right on public policy. And so the result is that everyone was kind of equally upset. And that coalition was able to maintain for a number of years, but eventually it broke down. And that's why the SPD ended up forming the weird traffic light coalition that it has right now with the Lib Dems and the Greens. Just enough people were exasperated with that grand coalition that they wanted some change. And it just so happened that the center-left party, the SPD, got more votes than the CDU, and that it made it more viable to create an alternative coalition with smaller parties without them. But that doesn't mean that there is not still the common interest in keeping what is portrayed as the far right. People can argue about that characterization in chat. They always do. But that norm is still in place, and if push came to shove, they would reform that coalition. So that's kind of where we are right now in the United States. In our case, the Populist Party, or movement if you prefer, has a lot more support than the AFD does. And so that's pushed basically the center right and center left together much more forcefully. And so that's why the Democratic Party right now feels very bland and unsexy, right? It feels like focus group style politics where they're just trying to cater their message to min-max the vote.
Mm-hmm.
And you can always kind of feel that, right? You can always kind of sense when a politician is trying to appeal to as many people as possible.
Ooh, do you want to know the example from Harris in the debate?
Oh, go ahead.
She made a gun comment. She was like, and about taking your guns, I have a gun. My VP has a gun. And it's like, okay, that's definitely batting really hard for the gun people. Good job.
Yeah. Yeah.
We know what you're doing there.
So whether or not that works out is an open question. All of the polling suggests it's going to be super close, even still. We still got time to go. We've still got to get through the rest of this month, and then we've got October. And of course, October is going to have more drama because whatever happens in October is going to be much more impactful on the election than most anything happening, in any other time, because it's because of proximity. So that's going to be the time to really tune in. You're going to see lots of fireworks there as everybody kind of unloads all of the weaponry that they've accumulated and developed to try to swing the election their way at the last minute.
Get your dirtiest dirt ready.
Yeah. Yeah, they're going to sling it fast and hard. And if the eating cats and dogs comment was any indication, it's going to get pretty wild.
What do they come up with next?
I'm sure it'll be as hilarious as it is exasperating.
It was interesting to think about how the meta of politics changes over time and what strategies people use to try to win people's approval and excitement and make them want to vote for them and stuff. And to have the bullying approach be like a standard one. Like Harris also was talking some shit in a sense. So it was kind of like her agreeing to the terms of engagement as they are rather than trying to have more of a approach like Hillary Clinton where she just kind of does the normal political stuff.
Yeah.
Was like there was this jab about like, yeah, go to his rallies, the crowds are really small. And it's like he couldn't let that go for the rest of the night.
That's what I heard.
Yeah.
Did he really harp on it that much?
Yeah, he went back to it, I think, multiple times. He had to like, they said, okay, we're out of time, we need to move on to the next question. Then he said, no, we need to go back to it. It's pretty funny.
Wow. Yeah, that's the trouble with being in politics for a long time. People eventually feel out your personality, your strategy, and they're able to develop countermeasures. So, when Trump was new back in 2016, people didn't really take him seriously. And so they didn't really study him that much. They just kind of figured they could just do the same stuff they'd always done and get a default victory. And so after that didn't work, of course, then people had to start taking him seriously. And so as they did, they started kind of figuring him out. And so, like you say, like in the debate, like he's got certain buttons you can push that'll get him off message.
Chat just gave a really good example. They said she should talk about his golf game.
Yeah, say what you will about the Biden-Trump debate. That whole golf thing at the end was hilarious.
I don't think I saw that one. I didn't watch the full... You mean the last one?
Yeah, the Biden-Trump one. Like, at the end of the debate, they just started going back and forth about, like, their golf scores. It was super non sequitur. It came out of nowhere.
That's funny.
They just sort of started riffing on each other. Yeah, definitely look that up if you ever have the time. It's deeply weird.
Sounds like
that whole debate was weird, to be fair.
Yeah.
But they ended on a strong note that really reinforced the weirdness.
Huh.
Well, thank you for listening to the debate, and keeping me abreast of it.
Yeah, I thought the unsung heroes of the debate were the hosts. They did a good job. You could tell they were nervous because it's a big job to get
Mm.
to have to manage that kind of discussion. But yeah, they did great. They showed up, looked professional, act professional. They did some fact corrections.
Yeah, I heard about that.
That was hilarious. I don't know. Maybe conservatives can tell me in the comments or in the chat if you felt like there was any slant in the hosts, because they were definitely checking Trump more than they were checking Harris, but I wasn't fact checking all of their stuff myself.
Mm.
But that's always something where if it's on a news network, it's hard to have like the perfectly neutral news network. Imagine if they hosted it on Fox News.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm surprised they were even allowed to fact check. I think one of the agreements made in the Biden-Trump debate was that they wouldn't do that. So I was surprised to read that they were doing it in the second debate. Yeah, I don't begrudge them the responsibility of that particular job. Pretty much no matter what happens, they're going to piss somebody off.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. No matter what you do tonight, many people will hate you.
Yeah.
And some people will think you did a pretty good job.
Yeah, you can ask Taylor Swift about that.
Mm.
And she came out right after the debate and endorsed Harris.
Huh.
She's been getting a lot of shit from it, from the exact quarters you would expect.
Mm-hmm.
But if she hadn't, she would have gotten just as much shit, probably.
Yeah. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think
Exactly.
it's bold that someone is willing to say who they support like that. Unless they're benefiting from it directly, which is dirty. If you're not doing that, then it's bold and fair for you to say who you intend to vote for.
Yeah. To be fair, you know, if Taylor Swift never made another dollar, she would be fine.
Yeah. She's
not
hyper
really
mega
risking
rich
too
and able to be canceled and still be super rich.
Yeah, yeah. So to a degree, being open with that kind of thing is a sort of luxury activity. Not everybody is in a position to do that. Well, what else did we want to get to? I've got stuff, but I wanted to ask if you had anything in particular in mind.
No. I watched like the debate, but that was most of what I browsed in terms of political stuff.
Gotcha. Well, there's always more drama in the Middle East.
What happened this time?
So the Houthis lobbed something at Israel. I wasn't very clear reading the article on it, whether it was a drone or some kind of missile. But whatever it was, it penetrated Israel's air defenses and it actually landed in Israel. Although the Israelis also say that it actually broke apart before it hit any kind of target. So it seems like while it penetrated the air defenses, the integrity of the munition was not very strong. And in the terminal phase, it just sort of fell apart. Not necessarily surprising. You know, the Houthis are not running like a super technologically advanced operation. But the Israeli government was not very happy about it. So, of course, they're issuing the usual death threats that are sort of de rigueur for the region. Something about making them regret it and strong retaliation. Yeah, the usual stuff, what you would expect. So we'll see what happens with that. You know, Israel is having to issue quite a few death threats over the past year or two. Generally, the United States kind of talks them down from doing anything too radical. But in the case of Yemen, I don't know that Washington really cares too much what they do. You know, if they want to go ham on the Houthis, Washington would probably be okay with that. Not least because there's not really much the Houthis would be able to do in retaliation. They can lob some more munitions Israel's way, but overall, the degree of disruption they can bring to bear is limited. Red Sea shenanigans notwithstanding. So we'll see what drama comes out of that. We'll probably be reading about the retaliation in the news in the coming week, I would expect.
Chat says Neuro for president, Agent Smith for vice president.
Why are you giving me the shit job? One, I don't want to be president. And, wanting to be president is about the only perk of being VP, since you have an advantage in terms of running after the president you serve over decides to leave. But I don't want to be president. That's a shit job if ever there was one. I'd rather be like Sec State or something like that. Or maybe Secretary of Defense, a job I could use to seize power, something useful like that. But VP? Come on, guys. I'm insulted.
Okay. That's funny.
Let's see, we were talking about Germany, so I actually did see an interesting item in BBC World News about Germany signing an agreement with Kenya that would allow a whole bunch of Kenyan immigrants to come to Germany for work. Apparently, the agreement is going to allow 250,000 Kenyan immigrants into Germany. I don't know if they're going to stagger that across time so that it's like a certain amount each year for 10 years that's going to add up to 250K, or if it's just like a general visa cap. Like, whenever they reach 250K is when they cut it off. But however long it takes to do that is just variable. They didn't specify that in the article. But it still seems like a lot for a country of 80 million in which immigration is a big political issue. I was surprised the German government moved forward with that. It's not going to be just anybody. It's not going to be just like regular dudes from Kenya. The agreement is specifically targeting skilled labor. Skilled labor kind of has an amorphous definition. They kind of mentioned, doctors and people like that. But one of the specific examples mentioned in the article was also bus drivers, because apparently they have a shortage of those in Germany. So apparently they have a broad definition of skilled labor here. Not to knock, that's not a knock against bus drivers, but, when they're mentioning in the justification shortages of doctors, nurses, and other people like that, I don't really put bus drivers in that same category.
To be fair, bro, have you seen people drive? There are a lot of unskilled drivers. So for a bus driver to have a higher standard, it is something that requires some training and certification operating a large vehicle.
Full credit, yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. But I would have thought that Germany would be able to produce people for that. But I guess not enough people want to do it, or there's better alternatives, Whatever the deal is, the German government felt necessary to include that in the agreement. And so there's some companies that are now trying to hire Kenyan bus drivers to come to Germany and work for them. So kind of a bold move given the political climate in Germany. I don't know if that's brave or stupid on the part of the current government. I guess time will tell. We'll see what happens in the next election. Let's see. Oh, yeah, we already talked about the shooting spree in Israel. We talked about the protests in France. Yeah, we did have... I had some stuff on Ukraine. We could do that.
Sure.
So there's not a whole lot of new developments. Russia continues to advance on Prokhorov. I can never remember the name of that city. I always call it Prokhorov, but I think it's actually Pokrovsk, something like that. Somebody in chat can keep me honest on that. Actually, that's a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I am most definitively not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. So, I will see the feedback. And it is much appreciated. I do enjoy the feedback. So that said, so the Ukraine news recently was mostly Joe Biden kind of cock-teasing that Washington might allow Ukraine to use American ranged fires, specifically things like cruise missiles and drones, in order to attack targets deep within Russia. And there's been a ban on it thus far because Washington is afraid of, potential escalation that could spin out of control. Ukraine says that's stupid. They're in the middle of a war. Russia is already using ranged fires on them. They should be able to do the same thing back. And so it's kind of at a deadlock and has been for some time, basically since the war started. So Biden released some statements earlier this week saying that he was thinking about changing that policy. And that resulted in a meeting a couple days ago between President Biden and Prime Minister Starner? Maybe it's Starner. Somebody in chat can correct me on the pronunciation of the UK Prime Minister, but basically the leaders of the UK and the US got together to talk about this, because the UK also gives Ukraine cruise missiles, specifically the Storm Shadow missile, as we've discussed
Storm
before.
Shadow. Such a cool name.
Storm Shadow. So they got together, and the result of this meeting of minds was no change in policy. So a little anticlimactic after the buildup. So it goes. I suspect eventually they'll come around on it, but for the moment, they're a little gun shy, or maybe missile shy is the better phrase. So we'll see if anything happens on that in the next couple months, but for now it seems like Washington is still a little too risk averse for it. So the other thing that I read just today, actually, is that Russia is apparently building a new drone that is built using Chinese components, which is not that unusual. Most drones are either bought directly from China or are Chinese drones that are bought via some kind of third-party country, since China technically doesn't, or at least pretends not to want to sell directly to either Russia or Ukraine. But they're also not trying very hard to prevent third-party sellers in other countries from just selling them on anyway. So effectively, the Chinese reticence on that has been totally non-impactful. Now, what's new about this drone, though, in particular, is that it's using a Chinese engine, which was actually originally made by a German company, which I found particularly interesting. So to kind of rephrase that, there was a German company that invested in China. In China, if you want to produce in China, you have to do it with a local partner. And so over time, this local partner eventually got the rights to build the engine itself. And so now that's the engine that they're selling on to Russia for use in the new drone that they're developing. So unintended consequences, for one. That's an example of that. But it also shows how much more sophisticated Chinese manufacturers have gotten over time. But the biggest issue here is that this kind of once again brings into question just how much China is helping Russia. Different sources kind of debate the extent of that assistance. Washington, in particular, has been putting pressure on China not to dig in and really help Russia a lot. And so this kind of raises the question of whether or not China is actually respecting that wish or if they're circumventing it. I think pretty much everybody expects them to circumvent it to some degree. But a lot of Chinese banks, for example, have been very reluctant to lend significant money to Russian entities, be it the government or companies, because of concerns over potential targeting by American sanctions, targeting of American sanctions on the part of the American government on them. So the result then is that there's been relatively little help because of that reluctance, because of fear of American sanctions. with some circumvention happening. Like, I'm sure major Chinese banks are probably reluctant, but there's probably some small niche banks that, probably most people have never heard of that are engaging in exactly that kind of trade. And again, re-export trade is, through the roof right now. So even if a manufacturer or a bank in China doesn't want to do business directly with Russia, you can totally do business with, say, a company in Uzbekistan. And oh, by the way, that company also happens to be a subsidiary of a subsidiary of a subsidiary of a Russian company, and totally is just buying stuff from China and then re-exporting it through Uzbekistan into Russia. So, circumvention totally happening, just the extent is what's in question. And so this story kind of brings that back to the fore. Is a Chinese company here going out of its way to help Russia? Is that help sufficient to trigger some kind of greater action by Washington? Those are all sort of questions right now that Washington is going to be looking at with this. Because it's one thing to sell cheap, small commercial drones to Russia, and also Ukraine for that matter. I don't think Washington cares too much about that because they're so cheap, that they're just too easy, basically, to make and to re-export and all that kind of thing. But with this new drone, it's bigger, right? This is more like the Shahed drones that Russia has been buying from Iran. So it's longer range. It's got a range of over 1,000 kilometers, for example. It carries much larger payload than any of the small commercial drones that have been a mainstay, at lower levels of the battlefield. So, if China does help them build this drone here, then that kind of brings into question their ostensible neutrality in the conflict. And that could lead to fireworks in terms of economic pressure from Washington, retaliatory moves by Beijing, and then potential tit-for-tat escalation out of that, depending on how respective leaders want to manage things. So, the status quo is always a pretty safe bet, so maybe nothing happens, but I did think the story was interesting enough to warrant mention here, and to kind of inform people that this could potentially blow out, depending on how serious Washington wants to take it. That's pretty much all I had on Ukraine.
Cool.
Did I talk about the Taliban last time?
I think so. What did they do recently?
Nothing in particular. There was just a question on Reddit about why the Taliban hate women so much. And I didn't really like any of the answers, so I kind of drew up some of my own, and I thought it might be interesting discussion. But I also can't remember if we already did it, so I was asking.
Gotcha. Why do you think?
Oh, well. Sorry, there's a couple different reasons, in my opinion. For one, I don't really think they hate women, per se. I think just traditional culture has a very particular place in society that women are expected not to stray from. And people, as with any sort of traditional culture, don't like it when those roles are challenged for whatever reason. So traditionalism, I think, is probably one of the main explanations. And again, all over the world, traditional culture kind of places women in a subsidiary position to men. So it's not that surprising that, traditionalists in Afghanistan are the same way. So in that sense, it's not really hate, it's just values, social values. So that dynamic just plays out the same pretty much everywhere. I had it in my notes here. Even when the West was still in Afghanistan before the withdrawal in 2021, you could still find plenty of places, probably most places in Afghanistan, that were still treating women badly, basically, from a Western perspective, still treating them traditionally from an Afghan perspective. We have lots of stories of women during the war, before, again, the Western withdrawal, having more freedom, getting more education, et cetera, et cetera. And, those stories were positive, but they were also mostly limited to very specific geographies within Afghanistan, specifically large urban areas, especially like Kabul and Kandahar, and then also the non-Pashtun territories. The ethnic Pashtun part of Afghanistan is also the most conservative, so they tend to produce a disproportionate share of the sort of stories, if you like, that you read about regarding how women are, mistreated for one reason or another, generally relating to traditionalism. That's not to say that the other areas of Afghanistan do not have their own issues with traditionalism, but generally they've been somewhat less radical in terms of their views on the matter. So the Western perspective of female progress, of women's progress in Afghanistan during the war, was always kind of biased. It tended to highlight the positives while ignoring the fact that those positives were not really representative of the experience of most women. And again, that was before the withdrawal. Obviously, things have changed after the withdrawal. Since then, pretty much even those pockets of progress have been eliminated. But just mentioning that there was still traditionalism before the withdrawal, that's just meant to highlight that things didn't actually change that much. So, this is a consistent feature of Afghan culture across time, through governments, up to and including the communist government that ruled it during the late 70s and through the 1980s.
Yeah, one of the things that, at least is my perspective as a non-expert, is that a lot of the Taliban's values are like super old school traditional interpretations of Islam, where if you follow Sharia law and stuff to the letter, you end up doing, I don't know exactly what stuff they're specifically referencing regarding hating women, but a lot of the heavy restrictions on women that Westerners would consider to be way too much, like being forced to wear coverings and so on.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff, it is written in the ancient text, so they're kind of like trying to go back to the ancient ways, which a lot of people would disagree with, and fairly. But yeah, it's a system, and that's one of the things that they promised when they were trying to fight for the support of the local people is, hey, we're going to prioritize your religious beliefs. And granted, it is one type of interpretation of those beliefs, but yeah, they're rooted in something.
Well, that's actually one of my next points, which is that traditional culture is, or at least was at one point, functional in a way that made it practical, in a way that makes it practical in traditional communities. So, for example, generally it's been the sons that provide for a family. If you have a daughter, generally she becomes basically like the de facto property of whatever family she marries into. So that's not a source of revenue for you if you're the parent, right? Again, it's the sons that are going to mostly take care of you. So it's better for you to have more sons, and if you do have a daughter, it's better for you to kind of unload her as soon as possible, because otherwise she's just kind of dead weight. All of the resources you put into her upbringing are not going to be returned to you for the most part later on in life after she's been married off. So there's actually an incentive to marry daughters off when they're younger, just so you can save the money. And also, because there's this incentive to marry them off, there's a very strong incentive to try to ensure that their reputation is as good as possible, so you can make it as likely as possible that you can marry them off. So reputation is very important in traditional communities for a variety of reasons, not least of which is the lack of information. It's kind of hard to know who to trust in a low information environment where you can't just hop onto Google and check somebody's background. So having a strong reputation is very important, partly for that reason, but also for the reason that you, your family, and your daughter need to have good reputations in order to marry into a good family, or even just to get married at all. Just so you can get her out the door. So traditional customs of controlling women, controlling their movements, limiting how they can behave in public, all of that serves to reinforce that underlying need to maintain a positive reputation, and it serves to make that easier. So again, that's all very functional. As Westerners, we don't really like that very much. We kind of challenge the underlying dynamic of just marrying daughters off and whatnot, and depending on sons for basically your retirement fund. we have totally institutions that kind of substitute that role. So that whole custom is basically obsolete here. We've replaced it with a different mechanism. So it seems archaic to us. But if you're still living in that society, the norm of controlling your women so that you can more easily marry them off, that's still a functional custom, as well as all of the other related customs that kind of help you do that. And so that's one of the challenges that people face when they're going into traditional communities to try to, quote unquote, modernize them. Giving women more education is nice. Certainly it's helpful for them. But if you live in a traditional community as a woman, your prospects for getting a decent job with that education are already very limited. And what's worse, if you can't get a job, then it's actually much more difficult for you to get married as an educated woman in a traditional society than it is if you're less educated. Because the way the marriage market works, basically men don't want to marry women who are more educated than they are. It's funny, but that's actually true. That's kind of a norm. And so because of that, a lot of families are very reluctant in traditional societies to educate their daughters because they're concerned that it could doom them. It'll basically put them in limbo where they don't have enough opportunities in the economy to take advantage of the education at the same time that the education makes it impossible for them to get married and enjoy a traditional lifestyle. So they're just stuck in between, and the parents are then just stuck with a dependent for the rest of their life that they may or may not be able to take care of.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of going back to the core of why did gender roles arise in the first place. And the short answer to me seems like you need to do a certain number of things to adult and to survive on the planet. And one person can't really do all the jobs very well and support multiple people doing so. So you need to divide the responsibilities, and the male and female responsibilities that society has come up with, and with different variations depending on what part of the world you're talking about. They put people into those roles. That as soon as you slot into people, what their jobs are. It makes it a lot less brain power to think about, okay, in our relationship, what are the things that you want to do? And it's like, it takes more intellectual effort to sort that out and to get to know a person and figure out what their strengths and weaknesses are, when a lot of it is modeled around just the biological dimorphism between men and women and the burden of reproduction. That seems like the big thing that is different between men and women is there's a vulnerable period of 9+ months where you're carrying another human inside of you, and you also need extra energy and extra protection during that time. Men don't have that, so they're frontliners, and they're like more likely to be the ones who fight just in general. And they're also relatively more expendable when it comes to like saving the women and kids. Like if you want to keep your population alive over the long term and there's a catastrophe, you send the women and kids off to the boats first, not just because maybe they can't lift as much, but because they're more precious in terms of continuing humanity in that sense. So a lot of those just basic biological differences mean that society has made up different roles for men and women that are varying degrees of ethical, depending on what they are. Like sometimes you can have a tradition that, even to a modern lens, could be a helpful and good tradition that's really nice. And then you can have certain breaks with tradition that can be an improvement on it and just improve the well-being of people overall. One example would be just from my family's life. Historically speaking, a lot of times women in the US and around the world were expected to do the cooking and the cleaning. And my parents, my mom cooks pretty much all the meals, and my dad pretty much always does the dishes after. And that takes a big weight off of mom, and it's a way for dad to practice gratitude by saying, thanks, Mom, for making the food. Now I will do the dishes so you can rest a little bit after dinner. That's one of those things where they're both making sure all the roles and all the jobs are getting done, but you could swap one job to one person or vice versa. You don't need to necessarily follow the ancient code of what men and women are supposed to do. But yeah, there's basically strategic reasons for why the roles were set up the way they were. And then one of the other key differences between men and women, and one of the reasons why women were oppressed for a long time, is the same concept as bandits and police force. It's the monopoly on violence. So men being on average physically larger means that they have the bully option to exert toward women, which obviously is wrong, but that's something that anyone who is a tyrant or an oppressor has access to. So it's one of those things where you need laws and visibility of certain things to make sure that women aren't being oppressed. So if you're a man, be careful about how you project your energy, because you can be pretty scary to people. It's better to be a gentle protector of others than to be an oppressor, but the temptation is there if you are the larger creature that can bully the other for whatever you want, their lunch money, etc. That's another one of the, I guess, key factors that meant that women couldn't really protest in the same way as you could violently protest, because if you're really trying to make change, ultimately it often comes to fisticuffs, and you need to represent a greater monopoly on violence, or at least inconvenience them so greatly that they don't rule over you anymore. It's a interesting track. And if you think about women only getting the right to vote in the 20th century, that is insane. So it's relatively recent that a lot of these women's rights issues have been getting a lot of traction. There's just a lot of history and stuff that has to be overcome in terms of people's perspectives. But you're right, the selling off of someone was something that was super standard in many different cultures, just because there is that financial responsibility where if someone is not working, someone needs to financially take responsibility for them. So traditionally, the husband takes financial responsibility for the wife, which means that in your example of if the woman is more educated than the man, then it feels kind of odd when if she's carrying a child, that she's doing that, and the husband is working a less intellectual and maybe well-paying job, and she's taking care of the baby. Like it's kind of new in that sense, and weird for people maybe. Yeah, big rant. I guess it depends on the cultural lens you're looking at it through, because you've got a Middle Eastern tradition, you've got European traditions, you've got Chinese and other Asian traditions. And if you're going to examine all of them and min-max them, then it really depends on what kind of rules you're talking about. I don't know if you're muted. Oh, he said he's back. His PC crashed. Oh no. Oh no. It's okay. Ow, my overlords! Can't make units because you killed my overlords. Survive. It's gonna die. No. It's okay. We will retake this base. Game looking spicy. I wasn't paying attention at all, and then there was an all-in. I was like, oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well played. This is a build. Good job. Good job. How many workers did we make? Oh my gosh. 32. Okay. Well, we can fill time. If you have any questions for me, I know I'm not as much of an expert as Agent Smith, but I can say things. Neuro mom plus neuro dad equals legends. Yeah, I do have really nice parents. They set a good example for me, and they have a very harmonious relationship between each other, which to me makes me have a more favorable view toward the traditional gender roles. I know that obviously you don't need to be a slave to tradition, but They do it well, basically. Dad does the yard work and the outside manly stuff. Handles the barbecue. He goes to work like he's the primary breadwinner. Mom has done a great job of keeping up with the place, making sure everything is nice. Also looking really cool, like she designs everything, decorates everything, manages a lot of the holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter and all that, cooks and cleans and that kind of deal. Also worked on the side a little bit, but Dad definitely primary. Shira Uso, think of it the tier 1. Arigato. Your parents had a very traditional setup, and now in their retirement, your dad controls all the finances, and your mom can't do anything without his approval. Yeah. Traditional gamer family, dad plays video games till 1 a.m., mom takes care of kids and house. Dad works, though, during the day? How good would it be to have an Ask Smith channel so Agent Smith can keep track of the questions and react to ones he answered and stuff? We do have one. It's like a special question handler role, which Fuzzy Cord, Moss Neotech, and Sea of Whiskey have. I think some other people have it. If some mod is present and none of them are present, then we could elevate someone to that. So I will keep you in mind, Dragorif, if that comes to pass. Taking care of kids in house is a full-time job, it just doesn't happen to pay. Yes, raising children is an extremely sensitive and demanding job, for sure. The kids don't really pay you. Maybe with like cute moments and wholesome memories, but they don't pay you dollars. Can you do a salute in frame for an emote? Let's see. We don't need headphones for that. Like that? Is that good? Was that funny? My arm is cropped. Oh, it is. I should be more this way. Why are you laughing? I'm just trying to do a normal salute and you're laughing at me. Is that it? Be like your parents. Keep the kids alive so you don't get arrested, but don't try too hard. I'm trying my best. Tried my best. Yikes? What's yikes? Agent Smith's going to be booting up his computer any second now. Thank you all for holding. He can jump into the channel when he's ready. That's a slow toaster. It's a very old and sentimental toaster as well. It's one that our mutual friend built himself. And he's upgraded it a few times since then, so it's not that old. Aura gets in his head about facing me. Sometimes he's just like, I never win against you. And then when he whines, he actually has a higher chance to win because he feigns incapacity. It's actually Sun Tzu. He's plenty strong. Believe in yourself. He's fine.
Hello.
He's back. Welcome back.
I don't know what the deal was. I didn't have anything open.
Was Twitch
Guess I
open?
should have
Was Twitch open?
No.
Did
No
you-
browsers were open, just Discord and a couple notepad files.
Oh.
So I guess I should have restarted before we started.
That's okay. Are you all updated on your Windows update?
No. If it were updating Windows, I would be restarting for like an hour.
Oh, no, I mean, do you know if you're current overall? Like, do you have the current patch of Windows?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
it's all good. I got it a couple days ago,
Good.
so it should be fine.
Cool.
Just old, I guess.
It's all good. We filled time, we're chilling. Having a good time.
So my apologies to the people listening and to you.
It's okay.
Don't mean to waste time.
We had
So
me do a salute so that they can make an animated emote of me saluting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any particular reason?
Well, I have a ton of animated emote slots. They just give you a whole bunch, and I've only used probably less than half of them.
Gotcha.
Good check, but yeah.
Well, I think you were saying we were talking about the Taliban and women and traditionalism. And I had mentioned traditionalism as being functional, historically speaking. And then you were saying something about women.
Oh, yeah. I went into a long rant about sexual dimorphism and how the bodies of men and women have differences. And that's the reason
Right.
for why the roles were made as they are. And obviously, there are a whole bunch of different interpretations, like Western gender roles, Eastern gender roles, Indian, whatever. But it's kind of like a caste system almost, where it just assigns certain jobs and societal duties to certain demographics, which makes it easy where you don't have to think about it every time, but it's not necessarily optimal for every family and every couple per se. But the main reasons for it were the mass difference in men and women. So men start out with the monopoly on violence, excuse me, which means they have the bully option, which means it's harder for women to relatively advocate for freedoms and rights and stuff across the board. It also makes men more likely to be placed in military positions and be fighters or frontliners or whatever for conflicts. So you get drafted and things like that. And then the burden of reproduction, so women having to carry children and stuff, means that they have a sensitive period that men do not. So for men to be a breadwinner and stuff for the family kind of makes sense, given there's that time where women can't be as active and mobile on the map.
Yeah. Division of labor.
Yeah, but since we're at a super high population right now, there's a lot less pressure on, we need to make sure we have more kids so we have more Americans. It's like we have a shitload of Americans in almost any other country you can think of, so it's not
Yeah,
the
no,
same
it's
as in
pressing.
the old times.
And so I think those are all sort of important factors to understand, like the role of traditionalism in defining women's place in society and why those norms tend to stick over time. Division of labor, and then customs designed to control women so they're easier to marry off. since they're not as valuable to the parents as supports in their retirement. So, those factors continue to dominate much of Afghanistan because much of Afghanistan is still traditional in nature. And the fact that those norms are still not only prevalent but functional is why a lot of people, if not most people, continue to treat women the way that they do. So traditionalism is part of the answer then as to why the Taliban, quote unquote, hates women so much, if you want to phrase it like that. So another factor here is just political economy. So one of the things that changes culture, and this is something we've talked about before, is urbanization and economic development. And those are things that Afghanistan has not had much of over time, right? So Afghanistan doesn't have the same history as, say, East Asia or South Asia or Europe, or the Middle East, for that matter, of urban areas evolving as commerce, as international commerce specifically, ascends and picks up and pushes economic development forward to the point where those urban areas eventually developed to become major economic centers and to develop cultures of their own, in which there are sort of new urban customs that fill new functional roles that supplant and replace the previous traditional customs that no longer serve a purpose in a radically different urban environment. So, that process of demographic change and economic development hasn't happened in Afghanistan, and so there hasn't been the necessary shifts in the economy and in the way that people work and behave in order to challenge those old norms and replace them with new norms that reflect the new realities of a more urban, modern economy.
New modern economy is very different from an old farming or a herding economy.
Yeah, exactly. So, in a modern economy, you generally have a larger role for the state, for example. Generally, the state helps you out with your retirement. So there's not as much pressure to have as many children as possible so that you can have the security of knowing that your children will provide for you. Generally, you can depend partly on the state for that and also partly on savings, which is another thing that you can do in a modern economy that you can't really do in a traditional economy. There's generally more of an opportunity to make money in a modern economy and also to make a surplus over and above your cost of living that allows you to build up savings that you can live on later in life. So the result then is that women can participate in that kind of economy much more equally, and so you don't really need the same norms governing their behavior, since there's not that imperative to try to marry them off. They can just basically just be like anybody else, like the men more specifically. So political economy is a factor, and then in Afghanistan's case, there's also a path-dependent factor, which basically is a fancy way of saying that there's just peculiarities that are specific to Afghanistan that have influenced outcomes there. This kind of gets in the weeds a little bit, but the Taliban originated in South Asia, not in Afghanistan. I guess Afghanistan is kind of in South Asia, but specifically like British India. There was a big rebellion in British India called the Sepoy Revolt in the 1850s, I want to say, late 1850s. And, different groups participated, but one of the prominent groups was the Muslim community, especially the Muslim community in northwestern British India. And the rebellion went pretty badly, and the retaliation by the British was pretty nasty. And so Muslim elites in northwestern British India kind of got together and discussed why the rebellion had failed. And one of their conclusions is that they had been insufficiently pious as a community, and that they needed to focus more on improving the morality and the religiosity of their community. They also wanted to eschew violence, so it wasn't just about religion, it was also about recognizing that violence was not going to solve the problem that they perceived from foreign British rule. and that it would be better, instead of trying to fight them, to just make their community more resilient to the changes that were being wrought by colonial rule. So that was that was another reason why they wanted to kind of retrench on religion. And so one of the movements that was founded at that time in the aftermath of the failed rebellion was the Taliban, which translates as the students, by the way. So these were largely just religious people who wanted to form a new institution that would just teach people to be pacifist and pious. That was sort of the objective. It's a simplification, but roughly that's what it was. So originally it was not violent. They were not training like jihadis. This was meant to be just sort of a communal education, basically. And they had a number of madrasas around what is today Pakistan that filled that role all the way up into the 1970s. And what changed is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And the result of the invasion is that a lot of people were radicalized in the Muslim world, and in Pakistan in particular. And a lot of the students at the Taliban madrasas ended up abandoning their studies and then going to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And in the process of doing that, they were exposed to different ideas of how Islam could interact with governance and politics. There were radicals from all over the Muslim world that were going to Afghanistan to fight. And so the Taliban interacted with them, and their beliefs were influenced correspondingly, generally towards the more radical side. And you might ask then that if it was the radicals that were kind of leading that, then why wasn't it the radicals and not the Taliban? Or why wasn't it the radicals instead of the Taliban that ended up forming the organization that ended up dominating Afghanistan after the war? And so the reason there has to do with networks. The radicals coming from abroad were generally part of like small militias, or were even just coming as individuals. So they didn't necessarily have like strong networks. But the Taliban, more accurately, the students who had been studying in Pakistan under Taliban madrasas, generally they all knew each other. They came from the same background, the same schools. And so because they had a stronger network, they were able to organize much better than alternative groups. And the result is that they ended up being the strongest institution in post-war Afghanistan, to the point where they were able to effectively take it over. It also helped that they were able to kind of co-opt the radicals as they themselves became more radical. That is to say, as the Taliban became more radical in response to exposure to those foreign ideas, the foreigners themselves then became natural allies. So the war in Afghanistan had a unique effect on Islamists in Afghanistan, and also on what had been relatively peaceful Islamist students in Pakistan that had come to fight. And so partly for that reason, the Taliban ended up becoming radicalized and having what are even in the Muslim world considered extreme views about how women should be governed by an Islamic government. So that's also an important factor to keep in mind. This even people in like Saudi Arabia, India, Pakistan, even they kind of see the Taliban in Afghanistan as being very backward and retrograde. So that's not necessarily a Muslim thing, or even necessarily a traditionalist thing. It's kind of a radicalized vision that was forged, if you like, in the war in the 1980s. Wars tend to have a radicalizing effect to varying degrees on politics, so that's not necessarily surprising. So those are three reasons then why women are treated badly by Western notions, perceptions in Afghanistan. Traditionalism, they've kind of always been treated that way to a degree. Political economy, there's not a lot of countervailing social forces to challenge those traditions. And then the war in the 1980s, which supercharged and empowered the most radical elements in the Islamic body politic in Afghanistan. So I feel like those are sort of better answers to that question of why women are treated the way they are in Afghanistan.
Thanks for breaking it down.
Yeah, sorry about the break. I'm sure that argumentation would have been more cohesive if there weren't just like a random 10 minutes of silence there.
It's okay. It happens.
Yeah. Well, gave me a time to get some pickled onions. Been getting into those recently.
Yum.
Let's see. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, I'm down to go for, what is it, 7:35? I'm down to go until 9 my time, so 11 your time. And we can get in some BG3 as you like.
Gotcha. Let's see. What else did we have here? Did the Reddit thing. I don't think we had any questions, did we? Oh, actually, we did have one from Eche Fatum. Let's see. Yeah, I guess he was asking before we started earlier today.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's listed 3:30 today. Follow up on last week's question about the AfD in Germany. Could you talk about the pros and cons of having the anti-establishment vote split with more parties that appeal to that demographic, as is the case with the Bundesrat Wagenknecht? I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, much to the hilarity of German speakers, so my apologies. The pros and cons. So I guess the con would be that you're kind of reinforcing the underlying politics of that. I mean, in so much as you think the politics of the AfD are radical and are negative for the political health, for the health of the political culture and system in Germany. In so much as that's the case, just having more parties cropping up to try to cater to those tastes is not really positive. In general, moderate forces are probably going to want to curtail that as much as possible. So, that is the negative side. It kind of legitimizes the viewpoint relatively more. But there's probably a number of pros. Again, if you're a moderate and you don't like the AfD, the benefit to having more parties catering to that vote is that the power of any one of those parties is subsequently watered down. So, if the AfD just monopolizes all of those votes, they have a lot more power, relatively speaking, especially in individual states where they have more support. But if you can split that vote up amongst multiple parties, at least two, as is the current case, that makes it a little easier to keep them out of power, since, there's going to be friction between the two competing parties that are fighting for that anti-establishment vote. Hypothetically, it's not too big a stretch to see them forming a coalition. But it's possible, too, that, and I guess this is another benefit, that the parties competing with each other could result in the more radical wing getting their party, and then a more moderate wing of the anti-establishment vote getting their own party. And so what centrist forces could do is try to ally with the more moderate representation in order to exclude the most radical manifestations of the anti-establishment vote. So the problem there, again, is that you would partly be legitimizing the perspectives, which, again, a lot of them are very unpopular, especially with centrist forces. But if you're willing to give some ground and compromise on some issues, you could win the relatively more moderate anti-establishment party. And then in that way, you can probably mostly, if not entirely, defang the anti-establishment vote, or at least its more radical manifestations. So, that is part of the upside there. I guess those would be the two main things, kind of undermining the overall movement and then potentially making it easier to try to moderate it by picking off the elements of the movement that are politically closer to the center than the fringes. Yeah, I guess there's not too many cons overall. Pretty much just the one I could think of. But yeah, I mean, this is just how democracy works. Like, if you have a lot of people that genuinely believe in the AfD's message or are just generally disenchanted with the establishment, like, this is what's going to happen. You're going to get parties like this. You're going to get fringe political forces and voices and messages that are more well received and more readily received amongst the voting body politic. Ideally, some of the more centrist political forces will recognize that and will adjust accordingly to try to diffuse that. Just trying to reject it outright and not give any ground at all pretty much just guarantees that they'll eventually get into power sooner or later, which I assume is what you're trying not to do. So flexibility is required, and that inherently will require some compromise. Ideally, the way to try to stop, anti-establishment votes, or at least radically anti-establishment movements from gaining ground, is trying to prevent their catalyzing in the first place. Generally there's some issue or set of circumstances which is pushing people or attracting people towards that kind of anti-establishment message. So you can take steps to try to mitigate the likelihood of those types of events happening in the first place, or when they do happen, recognizing them as catalysts and trying to mitigate the impact by compromising to varying degrees. That would be the ideal approach. Once you get to the point where the anti-establishment parties are getting significant votes, you're kind of late. It's still salvageable. You don't need to necessarily just give up. You're kind of making things hard on yourself by trying to just ignore the problem until it's unignorable, which I feel like is what a lot of European countries have been doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the party he's mentioning here, and I think I'm getting this correct, but correct me if I'm wrong, but the party he's talking about is a party that was founded to compete with the AFD, specifically for the same voters who are voting for the AFD, but takes a much more left-wing message and focus. The AFD is famously much more of a right-wing party. Very anti-establishment to the point where there's some overlap with the left, but it's much more right than it is left-wing. So there was a new party founded which has a similar anti-immigrant populist type message and campaign platform, but which explicitly styles itself as a left-wing party that wants to fight for workers. So you can say that that's kind of a left-wing representation of populism in Germany, as opposed to the AfD's representation of the right wing of the populist movement there.
Cool, thank you. And if you have questions, chat, you can at me in the Twitch chat real quick. We did talk about the assassination attempt. Someone else was asking about some another Trump scandal with some person. Some affair thing, I don't know. Sounds like a civil court issue.
I think they're talking about Laura Loomer.
Yeah, I think
she's a consultant, I think, in the Trump campaign.
Oh.
Supposedly there's been some drama regarding her relationship with Trump. I haven't been following it closely. That kind of interpersonal politics doesn't really sway outcomes anymore. It used to. In a pre-Trump era, cheating on your wife would definitely be a big problem. That's actually what sunk John Edwards back in the day. I don't know if you remember him.
No.
He was running for president. I think he was like a senator from one of the Carolinas. I don't remember exactly. It's been a very long time. This would have been back in like the early aughts. I think the 2004 presidential election. And he had been doing pretty decent in the primaries, but then it came out that he'd been cheating on his wife with, I think, one of his campaign people. And that was enough. He had to drop out after that. There wasn't much he could do to salvage it at that point.
Damn.
But we've come a long way since then. These days you can have sex with a porn star and pay them off not to tell anybody. Not such a big deal.
Yeah. What also depends on the country in question as well. Like, who is the Italian guy, Berlusconi?
Yeah.
He's went full on with it, where it's like, yeah, that's my sin. And it's like, okay, he's just into it and he doesn't care. But for people who need to posture like American family values, you can't do that if that's your brand. Yeah. But if you set up your brand like Trump has or Berlusconi has, or you do whatever the hell you want, some people will just say, okay, that's just how he is. It's how he is. Yeah. It's on brand, makes sense. So, yeah.
That's where we are. So, yeah, I haven't paid too much attention to the Loomer story on that account. It just kind of feels like political drama that is kind of tabloidy in nature anyway, which always turns me off. But More importantly, I don't think it's going to matter. Nobody cares at this point. None of the other personal style behavior related scandals involving Trump have moved the needle at all. So I don't see why this one would be the one to change things.
Are we all from the USA? That's a good point to articulate our bias. The two people in voice communication during this segment are from the USA, but the chat has representation from many countries.
Yeah, we do tend to talk more about America. We're Americans, so it makes sense. But also, America is kind of impactful in the world, so that disproportionate influence does justify it to a degree.
Oh my gosh, I had to tell you something. I forgot what it was, but I just remembered. During the presidential debate, Trump versus Harris, Trump name-dropped the leader of a country and said that that person vouched for him, and that means that he is awesome. You would never guess, actually, you might be able to guess who it was, but he's someone who's in power, and I think he's a bad man, but Trump seemed to believe that it was really cool that this person gave him a shout out.
I'm guessing it was Vladiput.
No, it was Orban.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I was like, I know that guy from World Discussion.
Yeah. Weird choice.
Yeah.
Hungary, of all countries. I guess it makes sense. He has gotten pretty popular with certain alt-right groups within American politics, unfortunately. Yeah, I don't think Orban is an example to be emulated. Nobody really should really be looking up to that style of politics. But yeah, it doesn't surprise me that he homed in on him. Anybody who talks fondly of Trump generally gets in his good graces.
Mm-hmm.
Seems to be the move as far as dealing with him on an interpersonal level.
Yeah, flattery.
Shinzo
You
Abe,
can do whatever you want.
yeah, Shinzo Abe was very good at that. Back before he got shot by that guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the ways Japan was able to mitigate the impact of Trump's populist trade policy on Japanese-American trade. You know, because Japan had been kind of singled out by Trump as one of the countries that was, quote unquote, taking advantage of the United States and their trade arrangements. So there was a lot of concern in Japan, you know, that Washington might severely upset that trading relationship, which was very important to the Japanese economy. And so Shinzo Abe went out of his way to try to handle Trump. You know, there was a number of meetings, and you know, he kind of nailed it. Right, you never heard about Japan much during the Trump administration, and a lot of that I think was down to Shinzo Abe finessing the relationship very successfully. So you got to give credit to the guy. So yeah, you know, just kind of telling him what he wants to hear, and probably also talking about concessions, quote unquote, that you're willing to make that aren't really concessions. I saw a lot of that during those years too. That seems to be the move.
Yeah, well, for a lot of people who are, I feel like, approval motivated, for you to grant them anything is going to make them feel really good. And for someone like Trump, it's like they want to grant something more to him personally. If you speak to him personally, he's more likely to give you a good deal than if you talk about the actual economic reasons and the statistics as to why a certain plan of action is better than another one. Like that, I feel like will send a certain kind of person to sleep. But if you say, you're great, you're so great, you're really just great, then he's like, you know what? I like you.
Yeah. Such is the burden of the large ego.
Mm-hmm.
Easily to manipulate. Well, what else did we have? I did have some stuff on the espionage case that came out recently. There was another Chinese spy that was arrested here in the States, and I thought it was a interesting case study. Because I think people, well, a lot of these spies that get arrested are generally involved in some kind of technological development. You know, they tend to be scientists, researchers, people involved in corporations, you know, that kind of stuff. It's more corporate espionage than it is sort of national security related type espionage. Although at this point there is more overlap than there used to be. But in this case, it was different. It was a different kind of espionage. And it's probably more representative of what a lot of Chinese espionage is kind of geared towards, at least the parts of it that are not focused on trying to get technology they're not supposed to have. Wait, what did I do with it? So this was a woman who was working in the government of New York State. Oh, here we go. So yeah, over a period of 14 years, this woman had been secretly working as an agent of China. And she had been working in the executive branch of the New York government. Again, this is the state of New York, not New York City, just to be clear. And she eventually was able to get herself promoted to deputy chief of staff to the governor of New York. So that's within the context of politics in the state of New York. That's relatively powerful, but it's also within the grand scheme of national politics in the United States. That's not that important. So I would not have really thought that a foreign actor would be that interested in recruiting that kind of person. But apparently that's what happened. So the woman in question was named Linda Sun. You can kind of look her up if you want to learn more about her story. But she apparently used her position as, again, the deputy chief of staff to the governor to aid Chinese officials. And this is what I was most interested in, because I was really curious upon learning about this, just what the fuck a deputy chief of staff to a governor is going to do that would be useful to the Chinese government. So I went through the article and I listed all of the items that were written in the article relating to what exactly she did. So I'll just kind of list them here. She blocked Taiwanese diplomats from contacting the state government. Kind of makes sense given the tension between the mainland and Taiwan. If you're wondering, though, what the Taiwanese diplomats would be doing talking to a state government as opposed to the national government in Washington, it's not unusual for Taiwanese diplomats, as well as diplomats from other countries for that matter, to reach out to individual state governments to cut kinds of deals, basically, for corporations of one sort or another from their home country. Generally, these involve things like localized tax breaks, involving things that states control, like property taxes, maybe occasionally income taxes, little kind of goodies like that of one kind or another. And that's meant to kind of give an incentive for, either for a foreign company to come and invest in the state, or to incentivize the use of, the export or import of a certain kind of good that they're focused on. In general, states don't have very much power. Technically, they don't have any power to deal with foreign governments. That's a power reserved for the federal government. But there are little handshake agreements like this that they can do. And so this kind of diplomacy is not that uncommon. So in the case of the state of New York, apparently this woman was going out of her way to try to prevent these Taiwanese diplomats from contacting state officials. She would get notices from them that they wanted to make an appointment, and then she would just ignore it, basically. She also covertly shared some internal documents with Beijing. The documents in question were not exactly elaborated. I think it had to do with the next item, which is that she secretly, this is a quote from the article, she secretly helped the Chinese government access an official call about COVID-19 while enjoying, yada, 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 an official call about COVID-19. So this would have been back in 2020, I think. And there was a lot of questions in the Chinese government about, to what degree is the American government going to blame this on us, yada, yada. And so in pursuit of information about that, I think they tried to infiltrate this call because they wanted more information about that. So that's my best attempt at making that make sense, because otherwise I don't really know why Beijing would care that much, because it doesn't really matter overall. I mean, other than potential information about Washington's policy on China as it related to COVID-19, they're not going to learn much in a call like that. Not least because the government probably is not actually talking about its China policy in a phone call like that. They're almost certainly going to almost exclusively talk about the virus. that was running around at the time. So I suspect then that the internal documents that were mentioned that she shared with Beijing probably related to the same topic. Again, COVID policy, perhaps as it related to China. Because otherwise, I'm not sure what internal documents the state of New York is handling that would be of interest. Let's see. So there was also a specific example, where she added a Chinese official to a private state government call. This was specifically the example about the virus. So she secretly added a Chinese official to a private state government call about the public health response to the virus. So that's specifically what she did in that vein. Let's see. There were occasions where, she mentioned that. She worked behind the scenes to scrub mentions of Beijing's detention of Uyghurs. I think everybody listening probably is familiar with that particular issue. Also, she told another official that she had argued, this is a Chinese official, that she had argued with Ms. Hochul's speechwriter, I think that was like a boss or something, to get a mention of the Uyghur situation removed from a draft of the governor's remarks that he made in a speech at one point. Let's see, there was a Chinese official that asked if the governor could record a Lunar New Year video, and she apparently asked what the talking points should be, specifically the talking points that the Chinese consulate wanted. And I thought it was interesting that they basically just asked him to talk about holiday wishes, hope for friendship and cooperation, and specifically the phrase, nothing too political, was mentioned. So I don't think that suggests that the Chinese government is not interested in political objectives in their espionage in the United States. I just think it kind of betrays the fact that, again, as I argued earlier, there's really not much a deputy chief of staff to the governor of New York can do for them. So I suspect they kind of sensed that and figured that it would be better to try to preserve the asset by not doing anything overtly political with them here.
No, dude, didn't you hear them when the Taiwanese were calling? She ignored them. It's brutal. Think of the emotional damage.
Yeah, that's a mild win, if you're China, but that's not saying much. Yeah. That's something a forgetful secretary could have done, even.
That's specific forgetting, if you're forgetting the Taiwanese. But yes.
Oh, Hochul was the governor, yeah, her boss. Okay. I think those were the main things. Oh, she also drafted fraudulent invitation letters for Chinese politicians to travel to the U.S. And she wrote an unauthorized letter of employment to add a quote-unquote compatriot to the New York governor's Asian American Advisory Council. So that could have furthered Chinese infiltration of the governor's office, but that's also the kind of thing that you would expect from just a corrupt official in general who wants to give positions to a friend. So I don't even know that those particular last two examples are even outside the realm of normal politics in the United States. So in exchange for doing all this stuff, basically Beijing just gave her a bunch of money, supposedly millions of dollars in kickbacks, which they used to buy a $4.1 million house in New York. And they also used it for perks, including special home deliveries of salted duck. Very specific for some reason. They also bought a $2.1 million Ocean View condominium in Honolulu, and also luxury vehicles, including a 2024 Ferrari Roma sports car.
Wow.
There was also all expenses paid travel to New York, tickets to top shows, concerts, and sporting events. And there was also an employment opportunity in China that was proffered for one of her cousins. Also, that salted duck was apparently prepared by a Chinese government official's personal chef and delivered directly to their home.
They're playing it pretty fast and loose.
Yeah, this is really not subtle behavior. Like, if you're getting paid off by a foreign government, even if you're not really doing that much for them, it's probably helpful as far as not getting caught to not throw your money around.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure there's corruption in American politics to the point where maybe a deputy chief of staff to a governor could be making big bucks on the side. But like, even if that's the case, that still means that you should not spend a lot of money lavishly like that, such that you draw attention to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I'm a little disappointed in the Chinese spy agencies' operations here, because this seems like a lot of money to pay somebody for very little return.
Dude, haven't you seen any spy anime? Everybody knows that the main protagonist has a person they can call who can do anything for them. And in the interest of the mission, you've got to play it right, and you've got to defer to the spy in terms of what they need. Watch Spy Family if you don't believe me.
There you go.
Yeah. So that was her situation. She's an undercover agent. They're like, ma'am, that's not even that big of an office for you to infiltrate. Like, it isn't even that good. And she's like, shut up and give me the best salted duck in the world. And they're like, okay, that's part of your plan. It's part of the plan. Also, I need a Ferrari Roma current year. They're like, okay, if you need to undercover in the Ferrari.
Yeah, I would have thought that the her handler at least would have told her, like, maybe wait.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe wait until you retire or something. Do you really need all this shit, like, right now? Apparently so. So yeah, she was arrested and she's going to jail for a very long time, probably.
Will she still get the salted duck in jail, or is that off the table?
Shit. I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, if you're gonna work for a foreign spy agency, and one of the conditions of your employment is salted duck delivered directly to your doorstep, does that deal still apply if you're arrested? You still get that? I mean, there's an argument to be made, right?
You still get it if you can be elected president.
There you go. I imagine not. I imagine their agreement is probably null and void at this point. That would be my guess. So yeah, this is kind of an unusual example of Chinese espionage. I think most cases generally involve people that are more involved with technology of some kind, but the Chinese government also does stuff like this on the side.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't gather that this is one of their more well-run operations, given what I've read of it, but yeah, it does happen.
Well, they got caught, and it's kind of awkward. They're spying on our New York offices, but whatever.
That's pretty much what I said.
Yeah.
Deputy Chief of Staff to the Governor of New York. Whatever.
Yeah.
That's fine. You're not learning anything useful there.
Oh my gosh, chat's taking this one step further. She's still going to get the salted duck deliveries, but at the prison lunch table, she's not going to let the Taiwanese sit with her.
There you go.
Gotta double down on that.
That's what Beijing gets out of it.
Yep.
Influencing prison politics in the state of New York.
Yep. We did get a couple questions.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll just finish here real quick, because there was also another espionage case in the Philippines involving China.
Mm-hmm.
There was a woman named Alice Guo, who was a former mayor of a city in the Philippines. She had disappeared in July 2024 after an investigation started into potential links between her and the Chinese government. She had apparently been accused of protecting online casinos, which were allegedly prevalent in her sleepy little town. She was not mayor of like a big city. But apparently she had cut some kind of deal with Chinese organized crime involved in casinos, and the government kind of went after her for that. Supposedly it was not just like about gambling. They were casinos, but they were also involved in things like scam centers and human trafficking. So once the investigation started, she bolted, and then she popped up next in Indonesia, where she was arrested, and the Philippines is currently seeking her extradition. Now, to give you some background on this, during the Duterte years in the Philippines, he was the previous president of the country, there was a lot of investment into the Philippines from Chinese organized crime. There was a lot of things like casinos and, brothels, basically, among other things that were set up there. And the Duterte government had kind of an interesting relationship with them. You know, they didn't officially... I mean, they knew that illegal shit was happening there, but they didn't really crack down on it too hard. And my impression as an outside observer is that he was doing that as kind of a favor to Beijing. so that he could kind of cultivate a relationship with them to try to show that he wanted good relations. And that lasted through his presidency until the new president came in, whom kind of had an alliance with Duterte, but also was on bad terms with him. It's a whole complicated thing. But the new guy is Marcos Jr. Some of you familiar with Cold War history kind of knows the significance of that name. But Marcos Jr. was much more pro-American, and so he's actually been much more skeptical of Chinese influence in the country, to the point where he had no qualms with cracking down on all of the illegal activity happening involving the Chinese organized crime groups of one kind or another. So he cracked down here, and this is one of the manifestations of that. This mayor obviously had cut some kind of deal with the local groups, was probably getting paid off, and so the government went after her as part of the operations to shut down all of these illegal Chinese operations. Yeah, this is the kind of influence that people talk about when they talk about Chinese economic influence. China is not going to be a superpower in the American vein, most likely, where they build up a huge military and, engage in gunboat diplomacy to threaten people to get what they want. China's economy is large enough that they can influence politics in other countries just by manipulating and maybe threatening that relationship. So, the more you trade with China, the more vulnerable, rather, you are to potential changes in China's trade policy that could be, specifically designed to fuck with you in particular. So that gives you, as a politician in the other country, good incentive not to piss off the Communist Party of China. And that's a much more effective tool, because that doesn't require, a large military or threatening a war. You can just threaten economic interests in the other country, which is something the Soviet Union struggled to do during the Cold War because their economy was not great. But in China's case, they have much more linkages with other countries, and so they have many more tools in their toolbox of diplomacy that they can use as leverage to get what they want. It's kind of similar to what the United States did during the Cold War, where we had strong trade relationships and used those to cultivate alliances against the Soviet Union, and where necessary, as a bludgeon, to try to convince and coerce other countries to do what we wanted them to do. So China is actually using more the American playbook from the Cold War in that sense than the Soviet playbook. And so that's where you see things like this happening, where you get Chinese organized crime groups, which actually do have relationships with the party and the Chinese government, although it's kind of amorphous at times. And the government in China kind of uses those relationships to exert influence on different levels of politics in other countries. In this case, it was on a local politician who probably didn't have that much power, but that's still an asset. That's a relationship you can use, that's leverage you can use if you need to in some future contingency of one kind or another, perhaps involving infiltrating a spy into the government, into the target country, or maybe in terms of getting a favor. Again, Chinese politics is very transactional, so it wouldn't surprise me if there was some politician in China who had ties to organized crime who wanted to use China's economic influence as a leverage, not to pursue China's interest per se, but his personal interest, by, for example, asking a government not to crack down on his organized crime buddies. So that's the kind of relationship that kind of drives a lot of Chinese policy, both within China and in China's relationships abroad. In other words, with its foreign policy. That's not to say that they don't have legitimate national security interests that they pursue. Not everything is about corruption in China, but China's institutions suffer so much from corruption that it's kind of unavoidable. That's always going to be a major factor, at least until it's addressed, which seems unlikely given current circumstances.
Yeah, and corruption is also a norm, like you said, so it's not
Yeah.
easy to just make corruption against the rules.
Yeah, unfortunately, that can make its way into foreign policy. So, not surprising it's the case with China. It has been the case with the United States in the past, although the extent to which it's the case now is kind of debatable. There's a whole argument that chat could have about oil and its influence on American foreign policy. I'm sure they'll love that. Let's see. 2 questions. What's your take on Venezuela's claim that the CIA tried to overthrow its government and the recent arrest of American nationals? Yeah, it's possible, but I also don't really see the imperative from the CIA's perspective. Because America's whole position vis-a-vis Latin America since the Cold War ended has largely been one of benign neglect, maybe malign neglect, depending on how you want to frame it. You know, by and large, Washington hasn't paid much attention to Latin America. It's been much more focused on the Middle East and East Asia over the past couple decades. And, you know, even after those, like Europe would be more important. You know, Latin America has not been high on the priorities list. So I don't think the CIA has been that active there. And even when, you know, Chavez took control in Venezuela and after relations with the United States nosedived, Venezuela never actually threatened the United States. There was a lot of shit talking, but never any real threats. And the degree to which Venezuela actually aligned with, say, rivals of the United States, like China or Russia, was always pretty limited. You know, they never set up bases or anything like that. They never joined any formal military alliances. Even economically, ties were relatively limited. So, you know, for all of the talk that came out of Caracas about the United States as being like a malign imperial country trying to prey on them, they didn't really act on that kind of talk very much. You know, for the most part, they were quite happy to sell oil to the United States as much as possible. It wasn't until much later that the United States started applying sanctions on Venezuela's economy. When that kind of, well, oil sales to the United States had already curtailed by the time sanctions were applied. Pretty much all of the sanctions that were applied to Venezuela before, like full economic sanctions were applied, were pretty much just sanctions on individuals. And, you know, if you've been looking at the similar type of sanctions that had been applied in Russia against individuals, you know that they're not that impactful. You know, they're relatively easy to circumvent. So, you know, it was not American sanctions that sank Venezuela's economy. Like, it was already in decline well before America started applying sanctions to Venezuela as a whole. So that was really much more on the head of the government in that regard. But, you know, again, just that whole process of economic decline of Venezuela, like, even as tensions with America rose, they never went anywhere near the military sphere. And that's more what the CIA is concerned about. And so I don't really see, I haven't known any of the governments in the United States over the past 20 years to have seen Venezuela as like a major threat to the point where it would be a priority in terms of CIA activity. You know, the Trump administration kind of made more noise about that, but then like the one thing that they may or may not have done was send a couple guys in a boat to allegedly start a revolution, and they were caught immediately. You know, the Venezuelan government made a big show about it. Like, there's all these guys we got from, you know, Florida working for the U.S., and, you know, we've arrested them in order to stop their evil plan to overthrow the government. It was a whole thing at the time. So, you know, I don't think that was the CIA, because I would like, perhaps naively, to think the CIA is still competent enough to organize something better than that kind of amateurish operation. You know, I could be wrong. Maybe it was the CIA. Maybe they did something really badly planned because the Trump administration kind of leaned on them to. But I got to think that was more of like a private thing, maybe with some connivance by people working in the Trump administration. But it did not strike me as like a fully blooded CIA op. And again, I just don't think that the CIA has been active in Latin America generally over the past couple decades. I don't think they've just been focusing resources on it at all. So that's why basically I think that Venezuela's claim that the CIA tried to overthrow its government is false. I don't think that's likely to be true. Not because I don't think the CIA would like to or would not like to, but rather just because I don't think they care that much. Until Venezuela starts doing something much more threatening to America's interests in the region, like doing more military cooperation with China in particular, you know, maybe Russia, but almost certainly China, that would definitely get attention. And certainly supporting rebels in neighboring countries would get attention. You know, there's been rumors about that, about Venezuela kind of implicitly supporting some Colombian rebels. But it's unclear if that involved direct government support or if the government basically just lost so much administrative capacity as its revenue base imploded because of the economic struggles, that they just lost the ability to control their frontier. So if that's the case, they're not really supporting Colombia's rebels. Those rebels are just taking advantage of the Venezuelan government's failures, and more specifically, the vacuums in governance that are opening up because of those failures. So which is more accurate, I don't know. I haven't read enough about the situation facing Colombian rebels in Venezuela to know that, but I do know that there was some talk about that, but it never seemed that substantive and it never was proven. So until that changes, I don't think Washington prioritizes Venezuela, and I don't really take seriously these claims that Venezuela's government is in some kind of perpetual death struggle with foreign intelligence agencies. I think they're way overestimating Venezuela's importance in the grand strategy of Latin America.
But if they do get a bunch of really expensive salted duck shipped around, they need to look out.
Yeah, look out. That'll definitely get some attention.
It's so funny.
That salted duck must be really good.
Food is a major theme of today's world discussion. The final question we have is, aside from the Thai government, are there any other countries where their cuisine is used for soft power and being exported abroad with government support?
I have two things to say about that. So the direct answer to the question is South Korea. South Korea does exactly the same thing. Both Thailand and South Korea subsidize restaurants that sell their particular country's food abroad.
Huh.
So,
didn't know that.
if you're going to a Thai restaurant in the United States or a South Korean restaurant, there's a decent chance, it's not guaranteed, but there's a decent chance they're actually getting subsidies from with the relevant government, back in Thailand or South Korea.
Oh, man. That's like the best way to have your country taken over, is they just serve the best delicious food.
Yeah, I'm not complaining. The worst a foreign government wants to do is make Korean barbecue cheaper. I'm all for it.
That's based.
You'll get no complaints from me. So yeah, that's the main example. There must be some others, but I don't know of any particular case studies off the top of my head. Like, I don't know that China does it, for example. I'm pretty dubious they would. That's not really in the party's repertoire. I've never known them to do that kind of thing before. But that doesn't mean they don't. I'll kind of defer to chat. Maybe they know some more examples. So the other thing I wanted to point out here, and this is kind of peripheral to the question, are you familiar with pad thai?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a major dish in the sort of catalog of Thai dishes. And very good, big fan. Here's the thing, pad thai is not really a traditional dish in Thailand. Have you heard of this?
Yes, it's made for Americans.
Not so. Not so. Although they do kind of change how it's made to cultivate to our tastes.
Oh.
More specifically, pad thai was an invention of the Thai military government in the 1930s.
Oh.
At the time, the national government was trying to build Thai nationalism, and one of the things they wanted to create was a Thai national dish. And so they actually went out of their way to try to create a dish that could serve that purpose, and that's how pad thai was created. So it was not like an organic evolution of, a synthesis of Chinese and Thai or whatever other regional influences. It was actually created by government diktat, specifically to be a recognizably Thai dish.
Interesting. So probably not the same thing as like a General Tso's chicken or Kung Pao chicken. I think those two are like American manufactured things that aren't actual traditional Chinese dishes.
They have their roots, in Chinese cuisine, but for the most part, American innovations. Yeah, there's like, what is it? There's like 6 schools of Chinese cuisine, or 6 types of regional Chinese cuisine. Shandong is one of them. That's kind of more noodles and stuff. They tend to have more wheat-based products in northern China. Jiangsu is another one. That's where the Grand Canal went through. So there's lots of history with like merchant traders building fancy cities with lots of luxury things like fancy food. So that was kind of the genesis of Jiangsu cuisine. I don't remember what specifically characterized it, though. I think most people are familiar probably with Sichuan cuisine. That's the one that's known for being especially spicy. And I think a lot of American dishes actually originated as Sichuan cuisine, up to and including Kung Pao's Kung Pao chicken. Hunan is another one that's known for being spicy as well, but it's also known for being kind of dry. So they use more like fresh, dry ingredients and spices. So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4. Guangdong obviously is another one. So they're kind of known more for like seafood. Also, people there have a reputation for eating everything. You know, China kind of has a reputation for like eating dogs, basically, but that's undeserved. That's actually more just southern China. And even in southern China, it's just like very specific counties where they've done that, and to a degree continue to do that. So Guangdong cuisine is kind of the exotic one. Was there a Fujian? Was Fujian one? I'm struggling to remember. I feel like there was another one in the lower Yangtze as well. Anhui? Was Anhui one? I feel like Anhui was one, but I don't remember what characterized it either.
I don't know these things, so I don't know.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've read up on China. I was reading more China stuff earlier this year, and then I kind of got off of it, got distracted. Too many aliens to kill, I guess. Yeah, I feel like those are the main ones, though. Shandong, Anhui, Jiangsu, Sichuan, Hunan, Guangdong. And I think maybe Fujian. I'm not sure. There's got to be somebody in chat who knows what I'm talking about. Hopefully I don't sound completely crazy here. But as far as like American adapted Chinese food, I think I remember that most of it was adapted from Sichuan cuisine.
There was one more question in chat. Let's see. What's the current situation for the tension in the West Philippine Sea?
I haven't heard any new updates. There had been an agreement. I mean, we talked before about the drama with like the rubber boats. I forget what they're called. There's like rigid inflatable boat thing, the rib boats, whatever they're called. So there was a lot of action there, centering around the beached Filipino naval vessel. It's an old vessel that they purposely beached on this disputed reef so that they could have a presence there. So there had been efforts to resupply it. The Chinese were intercepting the supplies, and so it was a whole thing. There was a Filipino naval... What's the approach? There was a Filipino sailor that lost a thumb because a Chinese inflatable boat rammed his inflatable boat, and his thumb got caught, basically, by the hull. Oh, this was the pirate thing, you remember, because the Chinese actually boarded that boat and then forced them to give up the supplies that they were taking to the ship. Yeah, this is when they were fighting with, like, swords and knives and stuff.
Oh, yeah. And I can see of thieves out here.
So, yeah, that was the last big drama. There was an agreement after that to limit the supplies that were sent to the ship. And it kind of seemed like that might be the handshake agreement that resolved or at least de-escalated things. But since then, things have escalated a little bit more. You know, so there's been more of a Chinese Coast Guard presence since then. But there hasn't been any particular flare-ups that I'm aware of. Nothing especially dramatic like the pirate thing, for example. Yeah, so that sort of standoff is continuing apace. But beyond that, neither side seems to be escalating significantly either. So yeah, not a lot new there, really, as I understand it.
Chat says thanks. Well, this was a nice food episode. Got lots of different themes here, between the secret super Chinese spy with the very expensive salted duck to countries trying to take over the United States with delicious curry and bulgogi and Korean barbecue. So stay safe. If you're American and you find yourself going to Korean and Thai restaurants and purchasing their meals, you're being controlled by their governments. Well, appreciate you all. Thank you, Fuzzy Code, for handling questions, and Agent Smith for coming on. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.